Frank Beard, the founding drummer for ZZ Top, has died. He drummed with the group for nearly 6 decades, and a spokesperson for the band says he died in hospice care, surrounded by family and at his ranch in Richmond, Texas.
For over 5 decades, millions of fans knew Frank Beard as the steady heartbeat of ZZ Top, the irony of the only beardless man anchoring rock's most flamboyant, mythical trio. On stage, he projected an unflappable aura of Southern cool and rhythm. But behind the locked gates of his Texas estate, a completely different reality was unfolding away from the spotlights. When news of his sudden, tragic passing sent shockwaves through the music world, the silence from his inner circle was deafening. Now, his wife Catherine has finally stepped forward to break her silence, exposing the heartbreaking truth they fought so desperately to hide from the public eye. When you think of ZZ Top, your mind instantly conjures a very specific image. 2 towering figures draped in chest-length beards, hidden behind pitch-black sunglasses, standing motionless on a stage while their guitars scream through speakers powerful enough to rattle your ribcage. That image became one of the most recognizable silhouettes in the entire history of rock and roll. But there was always a third man standing behind that wall of sound, the one who never grew the beard, the one who rarely spoke in interviews, and the one who, for most of the band's legendary 50-year run, most casual fans couldn't even name. Frank Beard, the drummer, the heartbeat, the man who held the entire ZZ Top machine together from the very first downbeat in Houston, Texas, back in 1969. And here is the great irony that music historians love to point out at every opportunity. In a band literally named after facial hair, the only member without a beard was the guy named Beard. It became his signature, his quiet rebellion, his way of standing apart from the mythology while simultaneously being the foundation of everything ZZ Top built. But the mythology is exactly what we need to peel back right now, because the Frank Beard that millions of fans saw under those stadium lights was not the same man who walked through the front door of his private Texas estate every night after the tour buses finally stopped rolling. Catherine Beard, his devoted wife, has spent years fiercely protecting the boundary between Frank the performer and Frank the husband, the father, the quiet soul who preferred the sound of crickets on his back porch to the roar of a sold-out arena. By all outward appearances, their life together in the later years seemed almost enviably peaceful. While Billy Gibbons was still chasing custom hot rods and television appearances, and while the ghost of Dusty Hill's passing in 2021 still haunted the band's legacy, Frank had largely retreated into a quieter rhythm. He maintained his sprawling Texas property, kept a modest collection of classic cars, and spent his evenings in a way that would have shocked anyone who assumed rock drummers lived exclusively in a world of chaos and excess. He cooked. He read. He sat in comfortable silence with the woman who had stood beside him through decades of madness. That was the narrative. That was the story everyone believed. And frankly, that was the story Frank wanted everyone to believe. But Catherine is now telling a very different version of events. One that begins to crack the polished surface of that peaceful retirement portrait. In her first candid statement since Frank's passing, she describes a man who, in the final stretch of his life, was carrying a weight that no amount of Texas solitude could ease. She recalls nights when she would wake up to find him sitting alone in the dark, staring at old photographs of the band's early days, his hands trembling in a way she had never seen before. She remembers phone calls he would abruptly end the moment she walked into the room, conversations conducted in hushed tones with people whose names he refused to share. The calm exterior was real, but so was the storm raging underneath it. Frank Beard had spent his entire career being the reliable one, the steady one, the man who never missed a beat whether he was playing for 50 people in a dusty Texas roadhouse or 50,000 fans in a European stadium. That identity was so deeply woven into who he was that admitting vulnerability felt like a betrayal of everything he had built. And that, Catherine says, is precisely what made the final chapter of his life so devastatingly tragic. Because the distress was real, it was escalating, and it was happening in plain sight while the world assumed he was simply enjoying a well-earned rest. So what exactly was tormenting the man behind the kit? What hidden crisis was quietly consuming Frank Beard during the months the public believed he was living his best life? To truly grasp what Catherine Beard is now revealing, you have to rewind the clock. Not by months, not by years, but by decades. Because the tragedy that ultimately claimed Frank Beard did not arrive suddenly out of nowhere like a bolt of lightning on a clear Texas sky. It was a slow, grinding accumulation of damage that began the very first time he climbed behind a drum kit in a sweaty Houston club and never truly stopped compounding from that night forward. Let's be brutally honest about what being a touring rock drummer actually does to a human body. Every single night, for over 50 years, Frank Beard sat on a throne of chrome and wood and unleashed a physical assault on his own joints, muscles, tendons, and spine. Drumming at a professional level is one of the most physically punishing activities in all of music. You are essentially performing a high-intensity cardiovascular workout while simultaneously executing precise, complex rhythmic patterns with all four limbs, night after night, city after city, decade after decade. Now imagine doing that well into your 70s, in arenas where the stage temperatures routinely exceeded 100 degrees, surrounded by pyrotechnics and blinding lights, while the rest of the band stood relatively still in their custom boots. Catherine does not mince words when she describes the physical deterioration she witnessed firsthand. She talks about mornings when Frank literally could not climb out of bed without assistance. His hands so swollen and inflamed from the previous night's performance that he could barely grip a coffee cup, let alone a pair of drumsticks. She recalls the elaborate pre-show rituals that fans never saw, the ice baths, the anti-inflammatory injections, the hours of physical therapy conducted in cramped hotel rooms while the tour manager pounded on the door demanding they get to the venue for soundcheck. But the physical toll, as devastating as it was, is only part of the story Catherine is now telling. Because layered on top of the bodily destruction was something far more insidious, a psychological burden that Frank carried in absolute silence for years. She describes a man haunted by the pressure of maintaining ZZ Top's legacy after Dusty Hill's death in 2021. When Dusty passed, the entire weight of the band's continuity shifted. Suddenly, Frank was no longer just the drummer. He became one of the last two living links to the original trio, and the responsibility of keeping that flame alive became an obsession that consumed him. Catherine reveals that Frank began experiencing severe anxiety attacks in the months following Dusty's funeral, episodes so intense that she would find him hyperventilating on the bathroom floor, convinced that the band's legacy was going to crumble if he showed even the slightest sign of weakness. He refused to cancel shows. He refused to reduce the set list. He refused to acknowledge, even to his own wife, that his body was screaming at him to stop. And this is where the story takes a turn that even the most dedicated ZZ Top historians never saw coming. Because Catherine now confirms that Frank was not just hiding his struggles from the public and the media. He was actively concealing the severity of his condition from Billy Gibbons himself. The two men had played together for over half a century. They had survived lineup changes, record label wars, shifting musical trends, and the death of their beloved bassist. They were supposed to be brothers in every sense of the word. Yet Frank made the deliberate, calculated decision to keep Billy in the dark about just how badly things were deteriorating behind the scenes. He would show up to rehearsals with a smile, crack jokes about his missing beard, and pound through the set list as if nothing was wrong, all while Catherine waited backstage with a medical kit and a growing sense of dread. So why? Why would a man who had shared virtually every waking moment of his adult life with Billy Gibbons choose to suffer in such profound isolation? What was Frank so terrified of revealing to the one person who should have understood him better than anyone else on the planet? Every fan of ZZ Top remembers exactly where they were when the news broke. It hit social media like a shockwave, ripping through timelines and notification feeds with the kind of brutal suddenness that only the loss of a true rock icon can deliver. Frank Beard was gone. The words felt impossible to process, almost like a cruel internet hoax, the kind of fabricated celebrity death rumor that circulates every few months before being debunked by a relieved publicist. But this time there was no correction. There was no follow-up statement clarifying that the legendary drummer was alive and well. The silence that followed the initial reports was the confirmation nobody wanted to hear. But while millions of fans were processing their grief from behind glowing screens, Catherine Beard was living through a horror that no press release could ever adequately capture. And now, for the first time, she is walking the public through the harrowing sequence of events that unfolded on their Texas estate during those final, fateful hours. It started, she says, as an unremarkably quiet morning. Frank had been in relatively good spirits the night before, even sitting down at the kitchen table to play an old vinyl pressing of ZZ Top's Tres Hombres, pointing out specific drum fills to Catherine as if he were giving her a private masterclass. He laughed. He poured himself a second cup of coffee. He talked about a fishing trip he wanted to take the following weekend. Everything about that morning projected normalcy, the kind of mundane domestic routine that makes the sudden arrival of catastrophe feel even more violently jarring. Then, shortly after noon, everything collapsed. Catherine describes hearing a sound from the back of the house that she initially mistook for something falling off a shelf. A heavy thud, followed by a strange, guttural noise that sent a spike of pure adrenaline straight through her chest. She ran down the hallway and found Frank on the floor of his private study, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and erratic, his hands clutching his chest in a way that immediately told her this was not a minor episode he could simply sleep off. What followed was a blur of frantic phone calls, desperate attempts to keep Frank conscious, and the agonizing wait for emergency services to navigate the winding rural roads leading to their secluded property. Catherine recalls screaming into the phone with the 911 dispatcher, giving directions she had given 100 times before but suddenly could not remember, her voice cracking as she watched the man she loved fading in front of her eyes. When the paramedics finally burst through the front door, the scene that greeted them was one of absolute chaos. Medical equipment was scattered across the hardwood floor. Catherine was kneeling beside Frank, gripping his hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The paramedics immediately launched into their resuscitation protocols, their urgent commands filling the house with a clinical intensity that stood in grotesque contrast to the peaceful rural setting just beyond the windows. But here is the detail that Catherine insists the initial media reports completely glossed over, the piece of the timeline that was either missed or deliberately omitted from the early news coverage. The official narrative suggested that Frank's condition deteriorated rapidly and that first responders had very little time to work with once they arrived on the scene. Catherine, however, paints a starkly different picture of those crucial minutes before the ambulance pulled into the driveway. She describes a window of time, roughly 20 to 30 minutes, during which Frank was still conscious, still aware, and still attempting to communicate something to her that she could not fully decipher. His speech was fragmented, his words slurred and disjointed, but there was an unmistakable urgency in his eyes, a desperate need to convey a message that he clearly believed was critically important. What was Frank trying to tell his wife in those final, fleeting moments of clarity? And why does Catherine believe that understanding those lost minutes is the key to unlocking the full truth behind his tragic death? When the flashing red lights finally disappeared down the long gravel driveway and the deafening sirens faded into the distance, a suffocating quiet descended over the Beard estate. For Catherine, that sudden silence was more terrifying than the chaos that preceded it. One moment, the house was filled with the desperate shouts of paramedics, the harsh beep of monitors, and the frantic struggle for life. The next, there was only the hollow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Frank was gone, and the world she had known for decades had vanished with him in the span of a single afternoon. But in the high-stakes, multi-million-dollar universe of legacy rock and roll, grief is rarely granted the luxury of privacy. Within hours of the official announcement, the quiet sanctuary Frank and Catherine had built to escape the madness of the entertainment industry was completely surrounded. News vans idling at the front gate, telephoto lenses aimed at the living room windows, and paparazzi droning over the property became the immediate reality. Yet, as Catherine now recounts, the intrusion from the media was nothing compared to the cold, calculated maneuvers happening behind the scenes. Before Frank's body was even laid to rest, the phone lines began ringing with a relentless, unsettling frequency. These weren't just messages of sympathy from old friends. They were calls from corporate representatives, estate attorneys, record executives, and merchandising handlers, people who spoke in hushed, sorrowful tones before smoothly transitioning into aggressive inquiries about unreleased drum tracks, publishing rights, posthumous touring concepts, and the legal execution of Frank's portion of the ZZ Top empire. Catherine found herself thrust into an emotional war zone. While trying to process the agonizing void left by her husband's absence, she was forced to act as an unyielding fortress, guarding Frank's dignity and final wishes against industry vultures eager to monetize his passing before the ink on his death certificate was even dry. She felt completely isolated, cut off from the world, realizing that to the corporate machine, Frank was no longer a human being who had suffered and died. He was an asset that needed to be managed, audited, and preserved for future revenue streams. It was during this period of intense isolation, late one night while wandering through the heavy stillness of Frank's private study, that Catherine decided to begin sorting through his personal belongings. The room still carried his distinct presence, the subtle scent of worn leather, cigar smoke, and drumstick wood. She sat at his heavy oak desk, running her fingers across the polished surface where he had spent countless hours listening to music and reflecting in the dark. That was when she noticed something unusual. Tucked away in the back of a locked lower drawer, beneath stacks of old touring itineraries and financial statements, was a heavy, weathered leather-bound notebook. It wasn't a standard business ledger or a casual appointment book. The cover was secured with a worn brass lock, and written across the front in Frank's familiar, rugged handwriting were the words, "Private, not for publication." Catherine had lived with Frank Beard for decades. She knew his habits, his quirks, his routines, and the stories he loved to tell over dinner. But she had never seen this book. She didn't even know it existed. Hands shaking, she managed to open the brass clasp and began reading the handwritten entries inside. What she discovered across those hundreds of yellowed pages did not just provide a glimpse into Frank's private thoughts. It completely shattered the narrative of his entire 5-decade career. It was a raw, unfiltered, day-by-day account of the secret deals, the silent betrayals, the physical torment, and the hidden pacts that held ZZ Top together behind the curtain. Frank had been documenting everything. Every suppressed argument, every medical compromise, every behind-the-scenes manipulation, and every sacrifice he had been forced to make to keep the band's iconic engine running at all costs. What explosive secrets were scrawled across those hidden pages? And what did Frank write about his bandmates that Catherine was never supposed to find? Armed with the explosive revelations inside Frank's private journal, Catherine knew she couldn't simply lock the leather-bound book back in the desk and pretend she hadn't read it. The weight of its contents was suffocating. For over 50 years, ZZ Top had survived in an industry notorious for chewing up and spitting out legendary bands because the three men operated under an unwritten, ironclad code of silence. They didn't air their dirty laundry in tabloids, they didn't engage in public feuds, and they presented a united, unflappable front to the world. Whatever happened inside the rehearsal rooms, the tour buses, and the boardroom stayed buried within the trio. But that silence, Catherine now realized, had come with an astronomical human cost. Determined to confront the truth head-on, Catherine arranged an emotional, closed-door sit-down with Billy Gibbons. It was a meeting between the two people who knew Frank Beard better than anyone else on Earth, yet understood him through two completely different lenses. Billy knew Frank as the unyielding rhythmic engine of a 5-decade rock empire. Catherine knew him as the exhausted, ailing husband who struggled to stand up from the kitchen table when the stage lights were turned off. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, thick with the shared grief of losing a brother and a spouse. But Catherine didn't come to exchange polite condolences. She set Frank's handwritten journal directly on the table between them and forced a conversation that the band's inner circle had avoided for years. As she read excerpts from the journal, decades of carefully maintained illusions began to crumble. Frank's writings detailed secret pacts forged between the original trio going all the way back to the early 1980s, during the stratospheric success of Eliminator. According to the entries, the members had made a solemn agreement. The machine would never stop. As long as two of them were standing, ZZ Top was a living, breathing entity that could not be paused, cancelled, or shown to be vulnerable. When Dusty Hill passed away in 2021, that pact didn't dissolve. It intensified. Frank wrote candidly about the suffocating pressure of that commitment. He documented how the corporate machinery, the touring guarantees, and the monumental expectations of the ZZ Top brand made it feel impossible to step away. Every time his body gave out, every time doctors warned him that his heart and nervous system were reaching a catastrophic breaking point, the loyalty he felt toward Billy and the legacy of the band overrode his own survival instinct. He viewed bowing out not as a medical necessity, but as a shameful surrender that would dishonor Dusty's memory and derail the livelihood of the dozens of crew members who depended on them. Catherine recounts watching the legendary Billy Gibbons, a man who spent half a century cultivating an untouchable, sunglasses-clad mystique, visibly break down as the reality of Frank's silent agony set in. For the first time, the remaining camp was forced to confront the dark reality of what that 50-year code of silence had truly created. Frank hadn't just been playing drums. He had been performing an act of physical and mental endurance that was slowly killing him, hidden behind jokes about his lack of a beard and effortless Southern swagger. The brotherhood was real, but the price of maintaining that brotherhood's myth had proven devastatingly high. Catherine made it unequivocally clear that she would no longer allow the industry to spin Frank's passing as a peaceful, romanticized exit of a rock legend who simply rode off into the sunset. The truth had to be told, even if it dismantled the pristine legacy ZZ Top had spent half a century building. Because the deeper Catherine dug into Frank's final months, the more a horrifying question began to emerge from the shadows of his private notes. Did Frank Beard's unbreakable loyalty to the ZZ Top machine ultimately force him to push past the point of no return? And did his devotion to the band cost him his very life? For months after the funeral, Catherine Beard remained completely silent, retreating behind the gates of their Texas ranch while the world's music press churned out glowing retrospectives, nostalgic tribute articles, and polished commemorative broadcasts. Every major outlet painted a romanticized portrait of an untouchable rock icon who had lived the ultimate American dream: fast cars, roaring crowds, legendary albums, and a seamless ride into rock and roll immortality. But every time Catherine turned on the television or read a glossy magazine profile, an overwhelming sense of anger and frustration tightened in her chest. None of it was real. The story the public was being fed was a sanitized fantasy designed to protect corporate brands, preserve catalog valuations, and keep ticket sales humming for the tribute tours. It completely erased the brutal, unglamorous reality of what the music industry actually does to the human beings who fuel its massive engines. And so, Catherine made the deliberate, courageous decision to bypass the public relations firms, the record label spokespeople, and the sanitized press releases. She decided to step forward and tell the unvarnished truth herself. When Catherine finally broke her silence in a deeply personal, unfiltered public address, her words sent shockwaves across the entire music community. She didn't hold back. With devastating clarity, she peeled back the curtain on the crushing emotional and physical toll that 5 decades of relentless performance had exacted not just on Frank, but on their entire family. She detailed the hollow promises made by high-powered industry executives who showered the band with praise when arena seats were full and multi-million-dollar sponsorships were on the line, only to vanish into thin air the moment real medical crises arose. She revealed how the high-flying lifestyle so often glorified on television was, in reality, accompanied by endless doctor visits, crippling chronic pain, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. When an artist reaches that stratospheric level of fame, their vulnerability becomes a liability that managers and promoters actively work to suppress. Frank had been trapped in a gilded cage where admitting to weakness meant threatening the livelihoods of hundreds of people, leaving him to suffer in absolute solitude behind closed doors. Catherine spoke with raw emotion about the unspoken collateral damage of the rock and roll lifestyle. The wives, the children, and the partners who are left behind to bandage the physical wounds, nurse the severe mental strain, and endure the agonizing downward spirals when the roar of the stadium finally fades to black. She exposed how the industry treats aging legends like disposable commodities, expecting them to deliver the same high-energy performances at 74 that they did in their 20s, completely indifferent to the human cost required to keep the illusion alive. Yet, as explosive as her indictment of the music business was, it was not the most heart-wrenching revelation Catherine brought to light. As she neared the end of her emotional statement, her voice dropped to a near whisper, trembling with the weight of a memory that had haunted her every single night since Frank's passing. She took the audience back to the final hours in that Texas hospital room, to the bedside where Frank lay hooked to life support monitors, his strength fading by the minute. Catherine revealed that as the room grew quiet and the end became inevitable, Frank gathered every last ounce of energy he had left, pulled her close to his chest and looked directly into her eyes with an intensity she had never seen before. He wasn't asking for prayers, and he wasn't asking for forgiveness. Instead, he forced Catherine to swear an impossible, binding oath. A final, sacred promise that she was forbidden to break until the world was truly ready to hear the truth. What was the impossible deathbed vow Frank forced Catherine to make before he slipped away, and why did it threaten to change everything we thought we knew about his life? The vow that Frank Beard demanded from his wife on his deathbed was not about money, catalog rights, or the fate of ZZ Top's multimillion-dollar trademarks. It was something far more profound and far more painful to carry. He grabbed Catherine's hand, looked straight into her eyes, and made her swear that she would never let the world turn his life into a hollow, corporate caricature. He made her promise that she would tell the absolute truth about the physical agony, the silent compromises, the relentless exhaustion, and the emotional cost of playing the rock and roll icon for over 50 years. He did not want to be remembered simply as a cartoon cutout, the famous guy without a beard in ZZ Top. He wanted people to know the real man who bled for every single beat. For Catherine, fulfilling that promise became her sacred mission. In laying out the unvarnished reality of Frank's final years, she has stripped away the gloss and glamour to reveal the true human being behind the kit. Frank Beard was a man of extraordinary contradictions. Fierce yet gentle, famous worldwide yet intensely private, profoundly exhausted yet entirely unwilling to leave his brothers on stage hanging. He spent 5 decades holding down the tempo for one of the most explosive live acts in rock history, functioning as the quiet, unshakable foundation that allowed Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill to dance, spin their guitars, and become global legends. Yet, as Catherine points out, the real tragedy of modern celebrity is that the audience rarely sees the butcher's bill when the party is over. The stadium lights eventually go out. The cheers fade. The multi-platinum plaques collect dust on the walls. What remains is a fragile human body that has given everything it has to an art form that never stops demanding more. Frank knew the risks, and in many ways, he willingly paid that price out of sheer love for the music and an unbreakable loyalty to his bandmates. But he refused to let history pretend that the sacrifice didn't hurt. Today, inside the quiet halls of their Texas estate, the Beard family is learning how to navigate a world without Frank's presence. There are no more tour schedules taped to the refrigerator door, no more frantic phone calls from managers across 3 different time zones, and no more medical kits packed beside road cases. There is only the peaceful silence that Frank spent his entire adult life yearning for. A peace that arrived far too late, but one that Catherine is determined to protect at all costs. Before closing her emotional exposé, Catherine walked over to the safe in Frank's study, carefully unlocking the heavy steel door to reveal a final, sealed envelope accompanied by a cassette tape containing an unreleased spoken recording. It was Frank's final message to the millions of fans who supported him across 5 incredible decades. Recorded in the quiet isolation of his home studio just weeks before his body gave out. His voice was raspy, slow, and weathered, yet unmistakably steady. "If you're listening to this," Frank said into the microphone, "it means the rhythm finally stopped. Don't feel sorry for me, and don't turn me into something I wasn't. I wasn't a saint, and I sure as hell wasn't a rock god. I was just a kid from Texas who found a pair of sticks and figured out how to keep time. We gave you everything we had, night after night, until the tank was bone dry. All I ask is that you remember the sweat, remember the groove, and remember that behind the sunglasses and the show, we were just 3 guys trying to outrun the silence. Keep the beat going." Those were the final words of an icon who lived by the groove and died under its crushing weight. Frank Beard spent his life keeping the tempo for millions, but in the end, his greatest legacy wasn't the platinum records or the roaring stadiums. It was the unvarnished truth of a man who gave his entire soul to rock and roll, leaving nothing behind on the stage. Before Catherine concluded her revelation, she unlocked a safe in their Texas home, holding up an unreleased recording and a handwritten letter addressed to the world. A final confession Frank Beard insisted could only be revealed once. The dust settled. What secret did Frank carry to his grave that will fundamentally change how millions view ZZ Top forever?